We have a 23-year-old gentleman with no past medical history presenting with complaints of 4 days worth of nausea and vomiting, intractable abdominal pain as well. Physical exam, he's pretty tacky, breathing a little fast. He looks uncomfortable, kind of curled up in bed, holding his stomach, intermittently retching and vomiting. He won't really let you examine him really well because he says he's in a lot of pain. His abdomen seems to be diffusely tender, but he can't really tell you an exact place where it hurts the most. You throw a quick probe on his stomach, right upper quadrant sono looks good. You draw labs, send them. While this is cooking, the mom comes back and tells you that it's not the first time her son has been in the emergency room with similar complaints. He's been seen in many hospitals before, workup resulted grossly remarkable, but nobody seemed to be able to tell her what's wrong with her child. She also casually mentions that he smokes a lot of weed, and when he's home, he seems to spend a lot of time in the bathroom taking what seems to be to her like really warm baths. Coincidentally enough, the labs come back, they all look unremarkable. So this is more or less a classic presentation of cannabis hyperemesis syndrome or CHS. And we're going to talk a little bit today about the pathophysiology and then touch more on the management in the emergency room. So what is CHS? It's defined as a recurrent paroxysmal episode of nausea and vomiting with abdominal pain that are relieved by warm baths in somebody that's known to be a chronic cannabis user. It must be distinguished from another cyclical vomiting syndrome called CVS. The difference between the two is that the latter doesn't have a single identifiable or removable trigger, and is more caused by kind of allostatic or metabolic dysregulation among cognitive, behavioral, emotional things, among other things. Another thing to keep in mind is that CHC is somewhat of a paradoxical syndrome because THC, which is the active component in cannabis, has been known for many years to be a very good antiemetic. It's been used in chemotherapy-induced nausea and also as an appetite stimulant in critically ill patients, including cancer patients and HIV/AIDS patients. So how is it that a very well-known antiemetic can cause a cyclical vomiting syndrome? The short answer is that we really don't know. There are many theories out there trying to explain the pathophysiology of this syndrome, but no evidence for one mechanism as of yet. The general idea is that THC behave as an endogenous cannabinoid, and it affects in the body through the CB receptors. And there's another receptor called TRPV1 that's activated by THC and HIT, among other things, that's also believed to participate in the pathophysiology. So the different theories out there can be grouped into two groups. The first theory really focuses on the CB receptors, the second one, the TRPV1 receptors. The general idea is that it's the chronic time and concentration dependent exposures of these receptors to THC that causes a downregulation and desensitization of those receptors, leading to the paradoxical effect. So the general idea is that THC is a very fast-soluble product, and it stores in our body for a long amount of times. So when one first smokes cannabis, they get that euphoric high that you get when you first smoke weed. Then the product slowly absorbs in our fatty tissue and stores there for a long amount of time. When the bloodstream level of THC kind of dwindles, there's a slow leach from the fatty tissue back into the bloodstream, causing chronic activation of those receptors. So it is then theorized that in a chronic cannabis user, it is this constant chronic activation of those two receptors that causes a downregulation, desensitization, leading to the paradoxical emetic effect. There's also associated dysregulation of gastric motility. So we have the classic symptoms of nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain. And interestingly enough, these patients have found that when they take really warm showers, they get better. The mechanism behind that is that heat also activates the TRPV1 receptor, which becomes important in the management that we're going to talk about later. So when it comes to diagnosis in the emergency department, there are no criteria for the diagnosis of this syndrome as of yet. That's why it's gone under-recognized or under-diagnosed in the emergency room for a long time. It's a purely clinical diagnosis, so based on presentation and history. So classically, you have a young male, otherwise healthy, known daily or chronic cannabis user, presenting with these episodes of cyclical and intractable nausea and vomiting with abdominal pain that gets better when he takes warm baths and completely resolves when they stop smoking weed. It's generally not recommended to do workup on these patients if you have all of these cardinal symptoms. If it's done, it mostly results are remarkable. Some of them may have electrolyte derangement like hypokalemia because of the nausea. They can have an AKI because they're dehydrated, and sometimes the lactate also can be high. So when it comes to management, the management is mostly symptomatic and comfort care. So hydration, antiemetics, and an attempt to pretty much reproduce the hot shower effects that some most get relief from. So because these symptoms are, this syndrome has gone unrecognized for a long amount of time, most of the management we've had until recently has been for kind of case reports of approaches that have been tried in the clinical setting and reported to be effective in some patients. These include antipsychotics, beta blocker, antihistamines, and among other things. Until recently, because of the increase in cases, or better yet, our improved ability to recognize it clinically, there's been renowned interest in kind of providing us with tried and true ways to manage this syndrome clinically. And from that arose a couple of trials, one of which is the Harvard trial, which literally stands for Haldol versus ondansetron in the management of CHS. So this is a small retrospective control pilot study that pretty much looked at the efficacy of Haldol versus Zofran in the management of this syndrome. What they did is that they had three groups, two Haldol groups, so low dose 0.05 mg per kg, high dose 0.1 mg per kg of Haldol versus 8 milligram ID of Zofran. And the primary outcome was to look at the improvement of symptoms at 2 hours, namely nausea and abdominal pain. And also a secondary outcomes, they also look at things like length of stay, time to discharge, need for rescue emetics, and complete resolution of symptoms, among other things. And what they found was that Haldol outperformed Zofran across the board, so across the two outcomes. So currently it is the drug of choice, and Haldol is a well-known antipsychotic. It's the first generation POMD2 antagonist, and it's believed to reverse the CB1 mediated effects of dopamine in the brain. So currently it is recommended to administer it IV-IM as far as slow IV push. As far as the exact dosing, the literature kind of varies, but the general consensus is that low dose is better. In the Harvard trial, when they looked at the low dose versus high dose groups, they found that there was no difference in the symptomatic improvement, but the people that did receive a higher dose experienced a lot more EP side effects, namely the akathisia and the dystonic reaction, which required the use of H1 blocker. So currently the recommendation is to administer Haldol plus diphenhydramine 25 or 50 concurrently. So with Haldol, which is the drug of choice currently, there is some concern for safety, namely the EP effects that can be easily managed with the H1 blockers. There is also some concern for QT prolongation, but in the literature currently, the general consensus is that the effects minimal and not clinically significant at the low doses that is being used for the management of CHS. Another drug worth mentioning then is droperidol, because before the arrival of the Harvard trial, the best management we knew for this syndrome came from a small retrospective study that was done in Melbourne, where they looked at the management of CHS using droperidol versus metoclopramide or Zofran. They randomized a very small population to two groups, a droperidol group of 0.62 mg to 1.2 mg versus 8 of metoclopramide or Zofran. And the primary outcome was really to look at the length of stay in the emergency room. And they found that droperidol, the patients that received droperidol had about an average of 7 hours length of stay in the emergency room compared to twice of that for metoclopramide and Zofran. So droperidol is also a first-generation antipsychotic and is not a too distant cousin of Haldol. The only difference is it's twice as potent and it works a little faster. So the recommended dosing currently is 1.25 mg, slow push. The issue is that because of, there are a lot of reports about QT prolongation with the use of droperidol, and the FDA issued a black box warning. There was a decrease in manufacturing of the drug in the country and concurrently national shortage. Until recently, there's been data showing that the effect of droperidol on the QT prolongation is minimal. And they found that the increase in QT happens after 1 minute of injection, and there is no increase in the QT, time-dependent increase in the QT after injection. So it's starting to fall back into favor, and people are starting to use it again. So it'll be interesting to see in the future how Haldol performs against flurperazole in the management of this syndrome. So with Haldol being the drug of choice currently and having some safety concern, namely the EPs and the side effect and the QT prolongation, though minimal, in patients with known QT prolongation, there's another side effect of the syndrome in general is hypokalemia. So in the setting of known QT and hypokalemia, there's a concern for prolongation to torsade the point. So there's been efforts to provide us with an alternative to Haldol in patients with known QT prolongation. So one of those alternatives is capsaicin cream. Until recently, before this study was done, most of what we knew about the capsaicin cream was from, again, case reports and kind of anecdotes of it being used in the clinical setting. Until in 2020, a small study was done to kind of look at the efficacy and safety of capsaicin cream in the management of CHC. And what they did is that they randomized small population to two groups, a group that used 0.1% cream capsaicin and another a placebo group. And what they looked at was the improvement of nausea on a 10-point scale at 30 minutes. That was the primary outcome. The secondary outcome was the improvement of nausea at 1 minute, and also need for rescue medication and overall admission versus discharge. And what they found was that patients that used capsaicin cream had an improvement by 2 points at 30 minutes with an additional 1 full point at 1 minute, and also less overall need for rescue medication. So the mechanism is believed to be a TRPV1 receptor activator. It slows the signaling of substance P, much like a hot shower. This is why most patients have kind of learned to self-medicate by taking these compulsive hot showers. So case series report that the use of 0.075% capsaicin cream provides adequate symptom relief. In the literature, there is no consensus where the cream should be applied. Some report the abdomen, some the palm, torso, low back. Some suggest just asking the patient which part of their body they most usually receive relief from applying there. And most people have improvement in their symptoms after 30 minutes of application. Other alternative worth mentioning is the use of beta blockers and benzos. Again, the most commonly mentioned beta blocker in the literature is propranolol. Nobody really knows what it works, but there are some patients that have reported improvement in symptoms after administration of 1 milligrams of IV metoprolol at least twice. And as far as benzo goes, the idea is that it's a GABA agonist, so it works by sedation, muscle relaxation, and kind of ensolysis. And the agents most commonly used is lorazepam or diazepam, given 1 to 2 milligrams IV. Another drug worth mentioning at this point is olanzapine. And there have been a couple of case series or case reports, mainly in Spain, where some patients are endorsed complete resolution of their symptoms after 5 milligrams of olanzapine have been administered IV. This after the drug of choice, Haldol, had failed. The reason this is important to mention is because olanzapine is a well-known antipsychotic. It's been used mainly in patients that have active psychosis and they're also anxious and agitated. And it's a second generation antipsychotic. It has a better safety profile. It's not as a potent D2 antagonist, so less EP effects, less requirement for the use of H1 blockers, and also it has minimal action on QT prolongation. The caveat is that it's sedating because it has some serotonergic receptor activity, and it's not readily available in the emergency room. So it'll be interesting to see how it performs in the future in the management of CHC when compared to Haldol. So the baseline for CHC is that we don't know the pathophysiology. We believe it has to do with receptors that are chronically activated, causing a paradoxical emetic effect. The cardinal features are somebody that's known to be a chronic cannabis user. They have cyclical intractable nausea and vomiting, abdominal pain. They will tell you that they feel better when they take really warm baths, and their symptoms will go away completely when they completely stop smoking cannabis. Methods of treatment, you have to hydrate them, you have to provide them with good antiemetic control. And the drug of choice currently is Haldol, given plus with H1 antagonist, namely a diphenhydramine 25 or 50. Droperidol is starting to come back into use, so that's something available to you. It's safe to use. Alternative in people with known QT prolongation, capsaicin is your best bet, usually applied to the stomach. Olanzapine will be something to see how it will perform in the future if a study is done about that. So I would like to thank the people that helped me, Patty Chiu, Christina Kopchak, and Dr. Matt Turner. Thank you. Any questions? Uh-oh.